Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk at length about Lucie's buttons. So my name's Kimberley Chandler. I am a research fellow at London South Bank University, and I'm also one of the exhibition reviews editors for the Journal of Modern Craft. And today, yes, as I said, I'll be talking about Lucie's buttons. Is that okay, the sound? Yeah. I'd just like to start this talk by dedicating it to Professor Simon Olding, who I'm sure some of you know, a friend and colleague who sadly passed away at the end of last year. Simon was the director of the Craft Study Centre in Farnham, where one of the most extensive of Lucie's archives can be found, and where I spent the best part of a year in 2016 through to 17 leafing through Lucie's papers. Simon was always incredibly attentive and kind. He was a scholar of remarkable insight, and we all miss him terribly. So this is for Simon. I should also add that my research into Lucie's buttons was made possible by a research grant awarded to me by Dr. Helen Walsh, Curator of Ceramics at York Art Gallery, and financially supported by Sarah Nichols. This afforded me several months of research time to explore Lucie's so-called bread and butter work, making hand and press moulded buttons and jewellery for the home and international markets in the late 1930s through to the mid-50s in London. This research fed into an exhibition, this one, at York Art Gallery in 2018, titled Lucie Rie Ceramics and Buttons, and curated by Helen, which was incredibly well received. In her review for Crafts magazine, the ceramist Alison Britton described how the button displays were dominant for the colourful sensuality of her glazes and gave a fresh perspective on Lucie's creative output, having seldom been exhibited so prominently within an exhibition of her work, certainly within the UK. The initial curatorial idea had been to focus solely on the buttons, although given Lucie's relative disinterest in them, this raised questions, certainly for me, about the role of the researcher as a conduit between the past and the contemporary public, and the emphasis given to an artist's tangential creative production. While the buttons allowed Lucie to survive the war years and after, and enabled her to experiment with glaze colours, they were never her main preoccupation. Therefore, positioning them within the wider context of her output as a maker within this exhibition seemed both prudent and tactful. So for those of you who know less about Lucie's button making, in the first years after her arrival in London in 1938, Lucie, like so many émigré artists at that time, had to start afresh. Although she had received considerable success back in Austria, the upheaval of World War II and her subsequent resettlement in Britain was to set her back. Within this new context, which was then a stronghold of Bernard Leach's Anglo-Oriental ideals, Lucie's urban aesthetic was out of step with the status quo. But rather than wholly submit to Leach's influence, Lucie thought on her feet. And for the next 20 years, she would be involved on and off in making hand and press melted buttons and jewellery, initially in glass and later in ceramic, to meet the needs of couturiers, haberdasheries and private clients. And this was a decision that came to shape her biography. So Lucie's remarkable versatility as a button maker in the face of wartime austerity was the product of collaboration, challenging the notion that this modest and reticent studio potter was a lone agent, working tirelessly behind her wheel on individual productions. The buttons provide a material lens through which to reassess Lucie's studio as functioning more like an artisanal workshop. She enlisted the help of several assistants, among them the young German émigré Hans Koper, who was to become her closest associate, in order to fulfill orders for fellow Austrian Fritz Lampel, glass artist and founder of Bimini, and also her lover, which I don't go into so much today, but there it is, and without whom Lucie's button-making enterprise would never have happened. Lucie demonstrated resourcefulness in her sidestep towards the production of pottery accessories, understanding it as a means to supplement her income while continuing to experiment with her glazes. And it's this at times conflicting relationship between making for profit and the desire to experiment that marked her early years in London. So we're lucky with Lucie in that two fairly comprehensive archives that document her working life exist in two separate institutions: the Craft Study Centre in Farnham, which is part of the University for the Creative Arts, and the Sainsbury Centre in Norwich, which houses the Cyril Frankel archive of Lucie Rie. And both hold personal correspondence, photographs, technical notebooks, glaze recipes, order books, business correspondence, exhibition, publications, ephemera, and of course, records of her collaborations with Hans Koper. The papers and drawings and myriad order books and personal documents that make up the Lucie Rie archive in the Craft Study Centre, and which I'd like to focus on today, are materials gathered and boxed from 18 Albion Mews after her death in 1995, some 9,000 items. It's the most significant record of her life and work. Yet, as Sophie Heath, who surveyed the archive in 2005, has pointed out, it's neither definitive nor exhaustive. There is a restraint to its contents that is perhaps symptomatic of her character and of her professionalism and reserve. Any archive is inevitably an incomplete record, having undergone a process of selection during which information may have been excluded and discarded as well as preserved. And in Lucie's case, the archive at the Craft Study Centre is weighted in favour of her working life from the 50s to the 80s, of her production of tableware and bowls, bottles and vases. Lucie's papers are also rather haphazard, which, as historian Carolyn Steedman has commented, is reflective of how the archive is brought into being. She writes, "The archive is made from the selected and consciously chosen documentation from the past and from the mad fragmentations that no one intended to preserve and that just ended up there. And in the archive, you cannot be shocked at its exclusions, its emptinesses, and at what has not been catalogued." And this is certainly true of Lucie's papers. Examining these specifically for traces of her buttonwork requires more of an imaginative leap. This is our first clue into Lucie's relative disinterest in them. There is a discernible lack of documents of them in the archive, aside from a batch of candid letters between Lucie and fellow Austrian émigré Rudolf Neufeld, who was one of her principal button assistants and someone that we'll encounter later in my talk. Orders and copies of invoices for goods supplied by, among others, Wenger's Limited, a manufacturer of materials for the pottery industries based in Stoke-on-Trent, and of course her numerous order books. So it's these kinds of documents that have shaped my talk today. Rather than attempt to offer you a comprehensive account of Lucie's button making, which is inconceivable in the time allocated, I thought I'd structure my talk around 4 encounters in the archive. The first, a sketch in black ink of various jewellery forms dated around 1942. The second, a typewritten letter to Rudolf Neufeld dated 26th of June 1946. The third, several pages from Lucie's cashbook from May 1947. And finally, a handwritten letter to Lucie with a request for buttons dated the 4th of August 1953. So first, I'd like to share with you this sketch in black ink from 1942, around which time Lucie was working closely with a group of like-minded artists and émigrés under the aegis of Bimini, the glass manufacturer, run by fellow Austrian Fritz Lampel at 17 Great Chapel Street in Soho in London. Lucie was a particularly skillful draftsman, and her designs for buttons and jewellery always started with fluent drawings in ink or pencil in which she was working out her 3-dimensional forms and motifs, their surface patterns and textures. What's interesting about this document as well is that the Craft Study Centre has many of these pieces digitised and online that you can have a look at. And this sketch is upside down from the scan. And it took me a long time to kind of understand what was wrong with the image. But I believe this is the right way up. The sketches were often annotated with measurements and notes on surface treatment and glaze colour, and what is visible is Lucie's ability to render her designs quickly and imaginatively, and to modify, revise, and rethink her motifs. Here we can see the workings out of various jewellery designs, necklaces and brooches, and possibly pendants too, with a boldness and complexity that reveals Lucie's material intelligence. There are a number of loose sheets like these in Lucie's archives, with quick designs for ornamental buttons and buckles. Each is rendered as a plan view, seen from above the object, and elevation view from one side of the object, and they're all numbered. And while the designs do not appear to be drawn to scale, it's possible to decipher the relative width, height, and length of each. The designs utilise a language of drawing that is easily interpreted. So dotted lines often describe an indentation rather than a cutout. Shading suggests depth and contour, while lines around each object denote a polished or rounded surface. So Lucie demonstrated this high level of visual literacy with these drawings, and they enabled her to communicate her designs to Fritz, who had offered Lucie the means to earn a living at his Bimini workshops. Despite Lucie's appreciation of his help, it was to making pottery that she longed to return. And as early as 1942, there is evidence that Lucie tried to apply for a license to manufacture pottery from the Board of Trade, although she was unsuccessful. Where she was successful was in her application for a license to make these buttons for Bimini in October 1942, which she could do from her Muse studio. So she started out in Fritz's workshop, and then she very soon moved to her own studio and house at 18 Albion Mews. Fritz's influence cannot be underestimated. As a skilled artist himself, he was particularly attuned to Lucie's talents. It was the lack of demand for Lucie's pottery during the war that meant she could focus her efforts on producing these highly original ceramic models and thus enriching the range of his jewellery. It's unclear whether Lucie started making her models as prototypes to build on Fritz's repertoire of designs, which could then be translated into glass, or whether the intention was always to fashion them from clay. Either way, Lucie would have certainly felt more comfortable working with her preferred material. We can see echoes of these early sketches in Lucie's later buttons, some of which are downstairs, with their striated or rippling surfaces, and they've been carved or indented, folded and scored using various modelling tools. As early as June 1941, there's evidence that Lucie was accepting various commissions for pottery buttons and accessories, including those from Lowenberg, British designer Edward Molyneux, Drake, Sportswear and Packin. And it wasn't that Lucie ceased making Bimini's designs, but that she supplemented these with her own. So rather than rely on the die stamping technique used in glass to form her buttons, she experimented with hand modelling, throwing, and press moulding in her workshop. The second document I'd like to share with you is a typewritten letter from Lucie to Rudolf Neufeld, or her dear Rudolphus, dated the 26th of June in 1946. Rudolf was a fellow Austrian émigré who arrived in Britain a year after Lucie, and although he was interned in Australia until 1941, he is thought to have sought work through the Quaker Refugee Committee, which is how he first met Lucie, and while others of Lucie's button assistants were recommended to her through William Oley, artist and owner of the Berkeley Galleries in London. So Lucie and Rudolph's relationship was based on trust. It's obvious from various letters in the Craft Study Centre that Lucie greatly depended on Rudolf, who initially worked with her at 18 Albion Mews and whom she later outsourced work to at his farm in Llwyndu, Wales. I hope that sounded okay. The letters betray the closeness of their friendship, the efficiency of their teamwork, as well as Rudolph's boldness in questioning Lucie's business sense, which was a privilege not afforded to everyone. And also evident is Lucie's increasing displeasure in making the pottery buttons. So to give you a little more context, Lucie wrote this letter in response to a suggestion from Rudolf for how to make her button-making business more profitable. She writes, "The point is that I don't want to earn such a lot of money, but that I want to work less and to make pots," before reassuring him that I don't want to get rich with your cheap labour. We can sense Lucie's irritation, her exhaustion with making the buttons, and her refusal to discuss the profitability of the workshop. This closing down of conversation may have been due to Rudolph's persistence, and many of their letters edge into conversations about increasing productivity, or may simply have been due to what Lucie describes as one of her good old migraines, clouding her ability to cope with anything too complicated. What's also clear is her single-mindedness in matters of business. Please make the mould for this button. Name is Ossa. Part delivery is very urgent, like usual. 144 buttons are ordered. So if you can let me have 24 or 36 as soon as possible, I shall be grateful. Rudolph's own particular skill in fabricating the two-part plaster moulds and the speed at which he was able to press mould large quantities of buttons to order is also evident. And it was actually Rudolph's early interventions in her button-making methods that enabled Lucie to prosper. In his remarkable biography of Lucie, Emmanuel Cooper describes how she was briefly taken into hospital in 1942, at which point Rudolph took the opportunity to completely reorganise production. And not only was Rudolph conscious of the need to use press moulds, but also that Lucie should employ a number of assistants to help her. Interestingly, however, it wasn't necessary for them to occupy the same workspace, a workshop that was once described as a solemn space with little laughter. Lucie alludes to this in her admission to Rudolph, that his presence at 18 Albion Mews would be a distraction. It would be a waste of our teamwork, she says. That said, it is because Rudolph is so dear to her that Lucie can foresee the unravelling of an afternoon, which is supposedly for button making. So the community of like-minded artists, friends and intellectuals that Lucie surrounded herself with were also her means of survival and what carried her through this period of uncertainty. It's at the close of her letter that Lucie betrays her increasing weariness at an offer to stay at Rudolph's farm. But please, she says, shall I have to help you press and clean buttons? The buttons infiltrated her personal and private life, and at this point they were her anchor to her adoptive country, her main source of income, her shadow and her inconvenience. The third document I'd like to share are several pages from one of Lucie's many cash books, this one from May 1947. At first sight, the entries look rather crude, handwritten in pencil and with an entry on each line, but this rudimentary accounting reveals much about Lucie's workshop at this time. First of all, there was a level of intimacy and ease about the workshop, so day-to-day costs were relatively small, amounting to little more than stationery, postage, buns, bowls, brushes and lids, and her assistants were paid regularly. While Rudolph invoiced Lucie for his work, the other assistants were paid weekly wages, depending on their level of expertise, hours of work, and their relationship to Lucie. So we know that Rudolph was Lucie's sole assistant, button assistant, until 1946, although by the summer of that year he had returned to his farm in Wales, where he was soon taken up with other tasks. Here we have listed Camille, so that's Camille Hardy, who Lucie registered with the Board of Trade in the summer of 1946. Lucie's beloved friend and associate, the German émigré, Hans Koper. Ralph, the Austrian émigré, Ralph Myers, who stayed working with Lucie for 3 years between 1946 and 1949. French émigré Colette Duplessis, dates unknown, and Jupp Joseph Dernbach, who officially joined the studio in 1947. It's interesting to note that the scribbled entries here are not in Lucie's hand, suggesting that she was able to delegate duties to her assistants. And certainly it was around this time in 1946 that Lucie was permitted to focus more on her own pottery ware, and spurred on by Hans, the buttons were to become increasingly peripheral. Lucie could concentrate on making pottery at the wheel, while her assistants could assume responsibility for the buttons. There are numerous other examples of these cash books and order books that make clear that certainly by the mid-1940s, the button factory was prospering. The efficiency and professionalism of the workshop depended largely on the competence of her steady stream of assistants, and Lucie was to profit from their unending determination and commitment to her. And these are the most fastidious accounts of the workshop's production, often inscribed with drawings, quick notes on form and glaze colour, numbers and figures, and there are some more examples of these downstairs in the galleries. What becomes apparent is that despite her indifference to the profitability of the buttons, Lucie had engendered a workforce of skillful and ready assistants, each with their own particular métier, whose presence is inscribed in these pages and whose assistance in those early years in London was integral to her success. So in stark contrast to the fragmented papers that account for the buttons are the button moulds themselves. Heavy, cumbersome and enduring, they're silent witnesses to the industriousness and scale of Lucie's button years. They boldly take up space in photographs from this period, stacked on shelves and crowding the surfaces at 18 Albion Mews. On the one hand, this is the customary detritus of any artist's workshop, the tools, materials, equipment, and scraps, yet on the other, the moulds are a very particular kind of tool, one that denotes the streamlining of manufacture rather than the free-form activity of the potter's wheel, seriality rather than one-off production, and automation rather than handiwork. And for me, it's this intrusion of industry and rationalisation into the otherworldly realm of Lucie at her wheel that makes the buttons so compelling. Yet while the often hand-modelled button forms are endlessly pleasurable, it's their surfaces, these miniature sites of experimentation with their rich palette of glaze colours, ranging from gold through to platinum, burnt umber turquoise and soft blue-grey, that distinguishes them. Which brings me to my final encounter in the archive, a handwritten letter to Lucie with a request for buttons, dated the 4th of August 1953. It starts with a brief introduction that Mrs. Fielding, the letter writer, had admired some of Lucie's buttons that she had encountered in a weaving room, which we can assume is somewhere near Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire. She writes, "As I nearly always wear hand-wovens, I have a coat made of some of Mrs. Beale's weaving, and I should like some of your buttons for it." The utility scheme, a phase that started with strict regulations on clothing issued by the Board of Trade in the early 1940s, had been phased out by this point, which meant that women's fashion in the 50s was there for the taking. Mrs. Fielding goes on to describe the woven fabric and her preferred buttons. The colour is just the natural undyed, and buttons should be just stone colour, shading to brown rather than grey, and about the size of a shilling. Finally, she asked that Lucie write to her, quoting price and times of delivery, adding that you may have some suitable in stock. The letter is fairly formal in tone and in some senses, at least to me, naive. While on the one hand, Lucie received many requests like this for buttons, it's the lack of sensibility of the letter writer and her inability to see the skill and artistry involved in matching the button forms and the glaze colours to fabric without actually seeing a sample that undoes this request. So Lucie was careful to consider the scale of a button. She understood how certain shapes would sit on a handmade coat, for example, or how a smaller knot-shaped button might inhabit a hand-knitted garment. And as fashion designer Alison Welsh has observed, Lucie was a potter with an eye for the wearable, yet seeing a sample was an essential stage in this process. So Lucie replies to this letter 2 weeks later, stating simply that I could not make any buttons without a sample of the material and the size of the buttonhole. Very short and sweet. And what this brief correspondence identifies is the tacit knowledge of a maker who, after many years of fashioning buttons and accessories for clothing manufacturers, private clients and couturiers, had developed a distinct visual language that was both individual and unrivaled. Lucie's insistence on using an electric kiln meant that her glazes were consistent due to the neutrality of the firing process. And while this level of consistency was open to criticism among the more sober studio potters for whom experimentation with wood-fired kilns was vital, with buttons and accessories it was ideal. Their glazes needed to accurately correspond to the needs and spec of her clients. Besides, Lucie's modernist aesthetic called for a firing process that could achieve clean and clear-cut works. And as Lucie herself later admitted, her particular talent apropos of the buttons was in her ability to match glazes with fabrics which required a vast and versatile knowledge of glaze chemistry, and in particular the behaviour of the oxides. Rie had the undisputed mastery of glaze effects and colours, and it was this that singled her out for success. The most explicit recognition of Lucie's button-making skills, as well as the enthusiasm for pottery accessories, comes in the form of an advertorial for International Textiles in 1941, entitled Pottery Wear, a playful take on the convergence of ceramics and textiles that Lucie's buttons afforded. The short article praises Lucie's rich palette of colours, ranging from unglazed natural clay red to glazed colours, Chinese white, royal blue, scarlet, and some of them with gold. Her wholesale acceptance by the London couturiers, with the buttons causing quite a stir. And the article names two British fashion designers in particular, Edward Molyneux and Charles Worth, who are using pottery wear in their winter collections. Worth shows natural clay flat buttons on a red coat, while Molyneux's debris frock, and then there's Molyneux's debris frock, the pottery fastenings based on raid wreckage. So to finish, Lucie earned such acclaim not only because of her remarkable ability to capitalise on the fashionability of buttons during wartime, or the unique convergence of luxury fashion and small-scale ceramics at a time of increasing austerity, but also because of the collaborative nature of her button making. If we can think of the button as being functional only in connection to its other, the buttonhole, then we can understand the success of Lucie's enterprise as wholly reliant on its connection to a pre-established market for fashionable accessories, to the kindness and patronage of friends, and the conscientiousness of her assistants. And it's the presumed ordinariness of Lucie's button making that is so compelling. Far from being supplemental to her skill as an artist, this bread and butter work was her means of making way in a new and uncertain context. Thank you.